like to thank Bill and Ruthie Connick for sponsoring this week's drasha. Hashem should continue to watch over them and their entire family and bring the entire Connick family continued bracha. You know, I try not to repeat myself in different contexts during the week. I hope you'll bear with me. Hope some of you will bear with me. I'd like to discuss a topic that I actually had the good fortune to discuss at the beginning of the week on a Zoom in honor of the bar mitzvah of Azariah Younger. And I want to take this opportunity to wish Azariah Mazel Tov, and of course his parents, Mira Younger and Yaakov Younger, also a Mazel Tov. There's a very famous phrase regarding Noach at the very beginning of this week's Parsha, and it says, Esu Elokim hishalech Noach. Noach walked along with God. And on this phrase, Rashi draws a fascinating contrast. When it comes to Avraham Avinu, Hashem says to Avraham, Hishalech lifonai, walk before me. And yet, when it comes to Noach, Noach walks with God. So there's famous discussion in the Medrash, who was greater, Avraham, Noach. Rashi points out this distinction as a seeming indicator that Avraham was greater. Avraham walked ahead of God, and Noach walked with God. The contrast is striking. The conclusion based on the contrast is certainly understandable. But I don't know about any of you. I've always wondered, what does it really mean? What's the difference? What's meant by the phrases in the first place? What does it mean to walk with God versus walking ahead of God? And before we get to that, I do want to share a very interesting sforno. The sforno says that what's meant in the verse when it says that Noach walked with God, we have to understand the context. The previous phrase in the verse was that Noach was a tzaddik tamim, a perfectly righteous person. So many times when we hear a person is righteous, the connotation is they don't do anything wrong. But if I were to ask you, tell me, was Noach the type of person to reach out to his neighbors, to maybe to give rebuke to his neighbors who were doing the incorrect things? If the only description is that Noach was a tzaddik, Noach was a righteous person, you might think not necessarily. Righteous person means he never sinned. Says the Sforno, what it means that Noach walked with God is that his interaction with other people, not just that he didn't wrong other people, certainly didn't wrong other people, but that his interaction with other people was one of caring and kindness and attempting to help people in their spiritual growth. So he says that's actually what it means to walk with God. That doesn't explain the contrast to Avraham, but it's just an interesting pshat to think about. But what I'd really like to focus on for a few moments together is a fascinating explanation I saw from Rav Shlomo Wolbe, Zichrono Livracha. And Rav Wolbe suggests as follows. He says, Noach had great challenges in life. Noach had this task of living in a world that in many ways was immoral. He had this task of really living to his own sense of morality. But the one thing that was clear with Noach is the path forward. There was never a dilemma for Noach. There was never a moment, gosh, I wonder what the right thing to do is. It was always clear what the right thing to do was. It might not have been easy to do the right thing, but the way the circumstances presented themselves to Noach, the way forward was always apparent. The correct way forward was always apparent. And Rav Wolbe says that's what it means that Noach walked with God. Whatever step he took, it was always apparent what God wanted him to be doing. Avraham, on the other hand, had a very different type of life. Avraham had experiences in life that it wasn't even clear what the right thing to do was. And Avraham had to not only overcome whatever evil inclination everyone has, including Avram, to make sure to do what was right, to push oneself to do what was right. But Avraham had to analyze and reflect to figure out what was right. The most striking example of this is Akedas Yitzchak. God had given Avraham remarkable assurances regarding the nation that would come with him. It was very clear that Yitzchak was supposed to carry the torch for Avraham moving forward. And now God tells Avraham that he's to sacrifice his son Yitzchak. It seems to be a direct contradiction between communications. And theoretically, Avraham could have reached the conclusion that he really wasn't supposed to sacrifice Yitzchak. By the way, once he was ready to sacrifice Yitzchak, then he gets a message from an angel that he's not supposed to do it. He theoretically could have ignored the message of the angel. So much confusion. With Noach, the path forward was clear. It was just a difficult path. With Avraham, the path itself wasn't so clear. Just to give another example, we know, of course, that Avram experienced 10 tests. So one of the tests was that he received all these assurances from God. They would go on this journey for the sake of the service of God. And then once he would go on this journey, he'd find great blessing. Avram goes on the journey. Avram comes to the land of Canaan. And he gets there and he finds famine. And then ultimately, Avram goes to the land of Egypt because that's where food was. It's a remarkable thing. There's a dispute between Rashi and the Ramban if Avram did the right thing or not. One view says Avram failed the test. He wasn't supposed to leave Israel. God told him to go to Israel. It was a lack of faith that Avram went to Egypt. The other opinion says, of course Avram had to go to Egypt. He had to have food. The test was, would he keep on believing in God despite the terrible disappointment? So just think about that. If you say that Avram passed the test, it's such an unclear situation that the commentaries can't even agree what he was supposed to do. In retrospect, the commentaries can't agree what he was supposed to do. So could you imagine the confusion of the moment for Avram? What's the right thing to do? So Revolba says that's why when it comes to Avram's life, he's told his halech lefonai, your mission in life will be to walk ahead of me. It won't even be clear sometimes when you take steps if you're taking the correct step. But that's part of your challenge in life. It's a very, very interesting pshat as to the difference between walking with God or walking ahead of God. But then what struck me the most in Revolba's piece was he then goes on to explain how the challenge of Abraham is really quite a unique challenge because we normally don't experience such challenges in life. We live Noach type of lives. I don't know about you. I find myself many times in life not being sure of what to do, wishing I could figure out what was right. I find myself talking to a lot of people in life trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. Based on Revolba's model, it sounds like we're all walking ahead of God, and yet his point is that Avram was so remarkable he walked ahead of God. The rest of us are walking with God. So I was really somewhat befuddled by this comment. And then I thought about it a little bit more. And you might agree, you might disagree. But I think that when we have dilemmas in life, I think generally speaking, there are two types of dilemmas, broadly speaking. One type of dilemma, deep down, we really know what the right thing to do is. And our struggle is that voice that we try not to listen to too often, coming up with some whole deep, wonderful explanation why we should really do something other than what we know is the right thing to do. So that's not an Avraham situation. That's a Noach situation. It's just, are we going to convince ourselves that we should do something different? But deep down, we know what's right. But then every now and then we have another type of dilemma. And this type of dilemma, we honest to goodness don't know. We honest to goodness don't know. Should I pick up the phone and tell someone that I think they did something wrong? Or should I keep my mouth shut? Should I give charity to that organization, or is it better served using for something in the family? How much time should I spend at home, and how much time should I spend investing my energies in community? It's such a struggle. So aren't those all Avraham kind of situations? And I would posit the following to you, that actually, as long as we're trying our best and we utilize whatever resources are accessible to us to figure out what we should do, asking advice of someone who knows us well, a good friend, obviously in halacha questions, asking halacha questions in terms of what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. If we don't consult with people when we're not sure, then we're not even really putting forth our best effort. But assuming we did everything there was to do, we consulted, we discussed, we reflected, and then at that point, we honest to goodness don't know what's right, it could very well be that as long as we're trying, we've passed the test. Avraham's nisayon, Avraham's test was remarkable, because if Avram would have decided not to sacrifice his son Yitzchak, he would have failed terribly. So there, it's all about making the right decision. Hashem expects so much of Avram. By the way, that's Avram's whole nature. Avram's whole nature was he found God in a world that didn't recognize monotheism. So Hashem tests him further and pushes him further and says, you need to keep on building this capacity to plumb to the depths of truth, that you have to figure out what the right thing to do is in this case. And if you can't figure out the right thing, you failed. For us, God just wants us to try our best. I think I've shared this with some of you before. I sometimes have had experiences where I've had a dilemma as to what to do, and I've consulted with people older and wiser than myself. And I've taken great comfort in that. I really could go either way. I ask someone wiser than me what to do. They tell me what they think makes sense. It sounds reasonable to me when they explain their reasoning. And then I do it. And then after 120 years, if I get to heaven and they say to me, you blew it, I can always say to them, what was I supposed to do differently? I didn't know. I tried my best. I even picked up a phone and I asked someone's opinion, a respected person's opinion. What else was I supposed to do? So if you look at it from that perspective, every time we have a dilemma, as long as we're being intellectually honest with ourselves, every time we have a dilemma, we can always just tell ourselves, if I tried my best to figure out what to do, and I extended my efforts in that direction, then that's all God wanted anyway. So the truth is, from that vantage point, we really are living the Noach life. And if we do the right thing, if we try our best to do the right thing, we have the great merit of walking each and every step of the way along with God. And by the way, if after hearing these thoughts you say to yourself, not right, if we don't know what to do, that's the Avram challenge, then the words of consolation I would give you is that recognize for yourself, for ourselves, that if there's a moment where we truly don't know what to do, and we've tried and we've tried and we've tried, and we reach our conclusion, right or wrong, that we're walking along the same path, that same somewhat fuzzy path as our great patriarch Abraham. Have a wonderful Shabbos.